Dr. Ali Attai is a scholar of biblical hermeneutics specializing in sacred languages, comparative theology, and comparative literature at Zaytuna College in California. A point of dispute between Christians and Muslims is whether or not Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. Dr. Ali Attai will look to establish the historical plausibility of an uncrucified Jesus. Dr. Fatuhi presented a wonderful presentation on blogging theology about a year ago, and I've been thinking about this topic now for a while, so I'm going to cover some of the same ground, but also look at a few additional things. Inshallah, my presentation is a bit long-winded. Modern historians establish history by asking a simple question in light of the evidence: what most probably happened. So it is most probable that Barack Obama won the presidential election in 2012. Lee Harvey Oswald was probably not the lone wolf in the JFK assassination, and Constantine converted to Christianity after the Council of Nicaea, but it depends on whose history we're reading. There are four main criteria of modern historiography, including the first man to fly an airplane, the Wright brothers, and Alberto Santos Dumont. Historians look at four main things: multiple independent attestation of sources, early sources, criterion of embarrassment, and social coherence. In the case of Jesus of Nazareth, several early sources mention his death. Jesus was believed to have been the Messiah by his early followers, so they wouldn't make up a crucified Messiah, and the Romans crucified thousands of Jews in Palestine, so why should he be so exceptional? So in light of this, historians have concluded that Jesus was most probably crucified. The most compelling evidence for Jesus' death is that a lot of Christians in the first century said he was crucified. However, the question is, which Christians, whose Christian history are we reading? Both Muslims and Christians believe that Jesus' birth and end of his earthly life were miraculous in some fashion, but modern historians do not consider the supernatural, because they are naturalists, and the father of history in the West's Herodotus acknowledged the supernatural. The Hollywood movie Troy was all about Helen of Troy, and Herodotus thought that it was more likely that Helen was in Egypt than Troy in Asia Minor, so we've got to look again and perhaps question that as a true account. The night journey of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to Jerusalem in one night and his ascension into the heavens is non-historical according to modern secular historians who never consider miracles, but I would argue that the night journey is not unhistorical because the historical circumstances are plausible. Luke quotes Paul, who gives the account of his conversion at his trial. This story is a miracle, a supernatural event, but from a modern historical standpoint it probably didn't happen exactly as Paul told us. Paul was commissioned by the high priest in Jerusalem to bring Christians from Damascus to stand trial in Jerusalem. This is highly implausible historically because the high priest did not have jurisdiction over anyone in Damascus. Paul's conversion story is not only non-historical due to the presence of a miracle, it is plausibly unhistorical as well because of its non-supernatural claims, and because of its naturalistic claims, so it cannot be historical in the modern secular sense. I believe that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, journeyed to Jerusalem in one night because there is convincing evidence to me that he was a truthful man with unimpeachable integrity. I believe that Jesus ascended into heaven after his death, and I have good reasons for believing him despite the night journey being non-historical and implausible according to modern naturalistic historians. The focus of my presentation today is on the historicity of the crucifixion. The Quran categorically denies that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified, and a Muslim might say that he doesn't care what modern historians say because he believes that the Quran is the word of God and that Allah's messenger has direct access to history. I have confidence in my text, I have confidence in Allah and his messenger, and I believe that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that Jesus wasn't crucified. If a Muslim were to say all those things, that's fine, I understand. No one can prove that Jesus was crucified through the modern scientific method because it is either impossible to go back in time and actually witness the event or to reproduce the event. Dr. Fatuhi made another excellent point when he said that the Quran explicitly says that prophets were murdered by their communities in the past and that the Quran consistently revises biblical stories in a way that makes them more plausible historically. The Quran denies the crucifixion, which is highly implausible historically, and this denial should not be immediately dismissed as unhistorical, rather it should deserve our serious consideration. The evidence for the crucifixion is not nearly as strong as we have been led to believe, and if it is plausible that Jesus wasn't crucified, then no one can say that the Quran contains a historical error, and secular historians must admit that the Quran's position is at least plausible. We have a certain kind of axiomatic quality to seeing a crucified Jesus in our churches and memorials all over the world, but if we go back to the actual evidence in the 1st century, then there is reasonable doubt that this was crucified. The swoon theory is that Jesus was placed on a cross, but he didn't die, and the divine rapture theory is that God directly intervened and seized Jesus' soul before he could die from his injuries, and then he was seen alive once again alive. The swoon theory of the crucifixion is both in agreement with the Quran and historically plausible, but it cannot be easily reconciled with the broader Quranic discourse. The swoon theory doesn't quite work when we look at the Quran more comprehensively, because the verb katha is used seven other times in the Quran, and every time it means to restrain or avert from physical harm, so a flawed, beaten, bleeding Jesus is very difficult to reconcile with these statements. The Gospel writers maintain that Jesus was killed by human agents on the cross, but Paul claims that Jesus was resurrected by God. The Pauline resurrection of Jesus is where the bodies stay buried and appearances are in the form of visions. Paul never spoke of an empty tomb. That is a later development. I'll return to the empty tomb later. The swoon theory is historically a bit thorny, and Muslims would have to grant that Jesus' body was promptly removed from the cross at the request of one or more of Jesus' followers. However, the Jewish historian Josephus mentioned that he successfully requested Titus to remove 3 crucified victims. Pontius Pilate marveled that Jesus had died already, and Josephus claimed that Jesus was indeed dead. The swoon theory is problematic both scripturally and historically because most crucified victims were left on their crosses long after they had expired, and to deter others from committing similar crimes against the state. When it comes to divine rapture from the cross, secular history is a game of plausibility. While it is certainly possible that God intervened and seized Jesus' soul before his natural death, secular history cannot verify God's actions. The substitution theory is the most prevalent theory found among Muslim exegetes, and it includes some sort of supernatural identity transference in which somebody else was magically transfigured into the likeness of Jesus and then crucified by the Romans by instigation of the Jewish leaders. So there are myths about secular historians that I want to dispel before we continue, so let's start with the myth that secular historians are objective and unbiased and inductive. Secular historians are impeded by their respective faith commitments, while religious people are biased by their own experiences and emotions. They do not arrive at absolute consensus on all matters of history, just as we all make Jesus in our own image. There have been seasoned historians who didn't even affirm a minimalist history of Jesus, and there are now at least 2 peer-reviewed books written by highly trained modern secular historians that deny that Jesus even ever existed. Jesus started out as an angel in the Pauline epistles, but was later memorized by the Gospel writers who wanted him to be a man in an actual human history. The mythicist concludes that the Gospels are nothing more than historical fiction masquerading as true history, and that mainstream historians such as Ehrman, Martin, Allison, and Fredrickson, who vehemently defend the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth, arrived at vastly different conclusions. A brilliant historian, Tabor, believes that the Talpiot tomb discovered in 1980 was plausibly the tomb of Jesus and his family. However, Ehrman disagrees with Tabor and believes that the historical method of historical criticism has failed to produce consensus amongst historians. Dallas's project to find the tomb of Jesus and his family has failed, and this is a damning indictment by one of America's leading New Testament scholars. Secular historians can be very much at odds, and they also tend to change their minds. Muslims in the past had good theological reasons for believing the words of the Quran, and those reasons continue to hold true nowadays, but historically speaking, does it make sense to entertain the claim of the Quran on this matter? 100 years after an American black man claimed to be a descendant of Thomas Jefferson, his claim was verified by DNA analysis. If mainstream historians refuse to admit that they may not have gotten things right, they are guilty of the same type of dogmatism and deduction that they frequently accuse people of religion of having. Bart Ehrman has said many times that he does not consider the canonical Gospels to be very valuable as historical documents and points out the inconsistencies, historical improbabilities, and outright contradictions in the Passion narratives. He says this all the time, and I think the answer to that question is no end. When confronted with the Quranic position regarding the crucifixion, he suddenly turns Christian apologists tooth and nail to defend his opinion that the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most solid facts of history, and mocks those who say otherwise, yet among his primary pieces of evidence are the Gospels. The New Testament Jesus said something that contradicts the Torah 1,400 years later, so why would you believe him? God revealed the truth about Jesus 600 years later. The Quran's position regarding the crucifixion is analogous to the position taken by the Quran in 1963 regarding the assassination of John Paul II. Lee Harvey Oswald was the perfect person for the American public to hate. He defected to the Soviet Union a few years earlier and was apparently a dedicated communist. 2 days after his arrest, Oswald was shot and killed by a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. In September 1964, the Warren Commission concluded that Oswald assassinated the president and that he acted alone. However, several eyewitnesses said that they heard gunshots coming from a hilly area of several hundreds of feet in front of the president's motorcade. William and Gail Newman were close enough to hear Jackie Kennedy's horrified cries coming from the presidential motorcade, but were inexplicably not interviewed by the Warren Commission. On March 6, 1975, a short film shot by an eyewitness to the assassination was aired on network television. The film vividly captured the gruesome damage caused by the final bullet as it struck the president. The importance of the superb film cannot be overstated. Although nothing is absolutely conclusive, the film provided compelling evidence of a possible second gunman, and that by definition is a conspiracy today. However, people are split on the matter. Interestingly, only the youngest Newman's son believes in the standard narrative. The Quranic verse 4157 states that they did not kill Jesus nor crucify him, but it was made to appear so unto them, and those who differed about it, the crucifixion, were in doubt concerning it. The Quran claims that the early peoples had doubts about the crucifixion, did not have adamant knowledge about the crucifixion, and ended up following hearsay reports about some crucifixion event from non-eyewitnesses when there was a difference of opinion. Before we continue, I want to ask you about the verse where it says that a mage appeared to them that it was so. Who is the implied actor there who made it appear to them that it was so? According to the Quran, none of the evidence that Jews and Christians used to support Jesus' crucifixion was written by an eyewitness to this alleged historical event. These sources are conjectural, but back when the Prophet first uttered these words, Christians believed the following. All the attributions to Jesus turned out to be false, including the Gospels and Epistles, which were later writings that were either anonymously written or brazen forgeries. The Quran is correct. Most historians in this field are actually Christians in the US and Germany and France and Britain, and people like Urban are exceptions. What you've said is actually accepted by most historians who are Christians. Many Christians believe in the Trinity, but acknowledge the historical evidence suggests that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses. The problem is that most ordinary lay Christians are unaware of this, and continue to believe that Matthew the Apostle Matthew wrote Matthew, the Apostle John wrote John, etc. The Quran says that the forgeries of the New Testament have deceived people about their religion. In the New Testament, Jesus made false prophecies, not the real Jesus. The Quran also says that any man who claims to be divine is a liar. Lacona used the analogy of the Titanic and said that everyone agrees that the Titanic sank, but the details are in the peripherals. There is no physical forensic evidence of Jesus' alleged crucifixion, and the only Jew who was ever crucified is a single heel bone. I think he just made it up. Tens of thousands apparently crucified one heel, one nail, and the vast majority of the time victims were tied to their crosses, and only the Gospel of John says that Jesus was nailed to the cross. Church leaders have been reluctant to submit fragments of the true cross for scientific testing since what happened in 2016. A supposed fragment of the true cross was radiocarbon dated by researchers at Oxford in 2016, and the results were less than thrilling for the Church. The most famous Christian relic by far is the Shroud of Turin. The Catholic Church believes that the Shroud of Turin is a representation of Christ, not a relic. Two scholars have concluded that the shroud has nothing to do with the historical Jesus of Nazareth. The truth is that in the Middle Ages, the manufacture of relics proved to be very profitable, and relics were often sold to unsuspecting and well-meaning buyers for incredible prices. The Church conjured up the idea that most of these objects were contact relics. The four Gospels were anonymously written books that were later attributed to their supposed eponymous authors, but according to a near consensus of New Testament scholars, both confessional and non-confessional, they were actually written between the years 70 and 100 CE by highly educated 3rd or 4th generation Greek-speaking Pauline Christians. The Book of Acts can be convincingly argued that it was mostly a work of historical fiction, as it plainly contradicts material found in the earlier Pauline corpus in its revisionist history that severely sanitizes the conflict between what we call Yah and Camp Jane. Peter and Paul sound like the same person in Acts because they are the same person in reality. He said he was not there at the battle, so he created speeches and put them into their mouths. Ancient historiography was to invent speeches because there was no record of the speeches, and Luke as a man of his time would have done exactly the same, so we don't really have the words of Paul and Peter in Acts at all. The earliest author of the New Testament is Paul, who was not a disciple of the historical Jesus, nor had he known the historical Jesus. There are 13 epistles in the New Testament that explicitly claim Pauline authorship, yet scholars are almost unanimous that Paul only really wrote 7 of them. According to mainstream textual critics, over 40% of the books in the New Testament that many Christians consider to be the words of God were written by imposters. Paul of Tarsus is important for us right now because he was the first person to claim that Jesus was crucified. The Christian apologists insist that surely the disciples believed that Jesus had been crucified, but there is no compelling historical evidence for it, and we have no record whatsoever that James the Just Right was the leader of the apostles after Jesus' departure for 30 years. Burton Mack said that the first 80 years of Christianity were scrubbed with a Pauline sponge, and that the Quran is correct when it says that the Christians disregarded a significant portion of what was given to them by God. Burton Mack says that for almost 2,000 years the Christian imagination of Christian origins has echoed the gospel stories contained in the New Testament. That is not surprising because the gospel accounts erased the pre-gospel histories, and the inclusion within the Church's New Testament consigned other accounts to oblivion. The creed of 1 Corinthians 15. Paul of Tarsus, an ethnically Jewish apocalypticist and syncretistic Hellenistic philosopher, claimed to be the crucified Messiah who died for their sins. The Quran says that there was a plurality of Christianities even in Paul's day, and that there was a point of major contention among the congregations that Paul had founded. Paul had to convince his congregation that his gospel message was consistent with that of James, and also explain why the apostles sent by James to correct Paul's deviant teachings were, in Paul's words, false brethren and teachers of a different gospel. James the Just So in chapter 1 of Galatians, Paul tried to mitigate this tension by swearing before God that he was not lying. Paul's desperate oath to the Galatians reveals an interesting potential subtext. It is likely that the Jamesonian apostles accused Paul of being an unauthorized teacher of the gospel and a false apostle of Jesus, and they asked the Galatians to demand Paul to produce a letter of recommendation from James. The oldest extant manuscript of Galatians is called P46, and it's dated to 200 of the Common Era, perhaps as early as 175, but even if we take the permanent post like the early date of 175, Paul seems to have doubled down on his claims. Paul claimed to have gone to Arabia to convert the Catarites and Nabateans, but I doubt he actually went to Arabia, and I don't think Paul can be trusted. Paul claimed that the pillars authorized him right as a fellow apostle, but the verses are contested as well. After that, Paul felt it was necessary to score points with the Galatians at Peter's expense, so he claimed that Peter and other Jews who committed hypocrisy with him were not following the truth of the gospel. Paul can't explicitly condemn James, but he implies that the men that James sent to Antioch must have falsely represented James, and that the Jamesonian apostles were the enemies, not necessarily James himself. Peter's response to Paul's grief is not authentically dated, but we do have one side of the conversation with Paul. Paul's story of his showdown with Peter in Antioch reeks of fabrication. If Peter could not get the gospel right in 1 minute with a vision that he claimed was Jesus, what does it say about Paul's vision? Jesus bothered to hand-select and train a bunch of disciples who were ultimately going to get it wrong anyway and then forsake Jesus in his most dire time of need. The Gospels say this, but the Christian often forgets that Paul's genuine letters created many of the narratives and Gospel accounts. James was completely written out of the Gospels, even though Josephus tells us that he was the leader of the Messianic movement after Jesus, and if it weren't for the tiny epistle of James tucked in somewhere in the back of the Christian canon, James would have been basically written out of the entire New Testament. The early Pauline Christians, including the Gospel writers, claimed that James was an unbeliever during the life of Jesus because the claims of Paul and his epistles were highly influential. Paul puts himself on par with James and then goes even further to boast that he worked harder than any of them. Paul severely reprimanded the Galatians for allowing themselves to be swayed by the Jerusalem apostles sent from James I. Nazarenes into believing a different gospel than his own. The Galatians were convinced by Paul's opponents that the crucifixion of Jesus did not free them from the obligations of the Jewish law, but the wording of the verse and its overall context suggest that Paul's opponents disagreed with Paul's portrayal of Jesus being crucified. Paul cautioned his congregation to not let their minds be corrupted by accepting another Jesus and revealed that his opponents were of Jewish descent. He then provided a laundry list of his alleged sufferings for the sake of Christ. The subtext of the book of Galatians is that apostles from James repudiated the cross altogether and condemned Paul for teaching a false gospel. Paul told us that there were many churches in Christ sprawled across Judea, but no writing spoke of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. The first believer in Jesus' messiahship to claim that Jesus was crucified in recorded history was Paul, a man who admittedly persecuted Jesus' disciples before his Damascus Road conversion and slandered and ridiculed them after. Some of you say you are of Paul, others say you are of Apollos, Peter, or Christ, but this verse is very strange and has been notoriously difficult to make sense of. But throughout the centuries it seems that certain competing factions had arisen in Corinth. Paul says that Christ was divided and that he was crucified, but what he really meant was that the Corinthians should follow Christ by following him. Paul reprimanded the Corinthians for not believing his teachings when he first came to them, and if they didn't believe that, they didn't believe in his gospel. The crucifixion of Jesus was very likely the main cause of the dissension among the different factions in the Corinthian church, with some even rejecting Christ altogether because of it. Paul did not know the exact extent of the quarreling, but only that Peter's name was thrown into the mix. Paul wanted his congregation to rest assured that he, Peter, and James were on the same wavelength about the crucifixion, and that both non-Christian Jews and Jewish Christians were affected by the crucifixion. The mark in Jesus refers to Peter as Satan for objecting to Jesus being killed and says his mind is set on earthly things. Paul calls his opponents dogs who mutilate the flesh and enemies of the cross who set their minds on earthly things. Mark is well aware that there were Jewish Christians who claimed a link to Peter and denied the crucifixion, and Paul warned the Corinthians not to question Paul's authority or legitimacy. It is historically plausible that there were factions of Christians living in Galatia, Corinth, and Philippi who repudiated the crucifixion altogether. Most historians believe in the existence of Q, which is a written source of Jesus' sayings that Matthew and Luke used when writing their Gospels. Q is absolutely key for understanding what non-Pauline Christians believed about Jesus. The Gospel according to Q says nothing about the crucifixion of Jesus or the resurrection of Jesus, and the traditions found in Q are plausibly representative of Jamesonian Christianity pre-Pauline, Nazarene Christianity, and Jewish Christianity. Dr. Dennis MacDonald reconstructed the contents of Q and says that it was not written by a Christian but by a Jew who believed in Jesus but not in the Pauline sense, and that Jesus is making the Jewish law more compatible and more compassionate for people on the margins. The evangelists exaggerated the events surrounding Jesus' crucifixion to convince their readers that he was crucified, and in Mark there was darkness, an earthquake, and a zombie apocalypse. Some contemporary evangelical scholars have admitted that this is most likely a legend, and Dr. Mike Licona, who debated me several years ago, has changed his view. This has invited the wrath of many Christian apologists, including the notorious Norman Geisler. Licona believes that the other New Testament text may be legends, such as the mob falling backward at Jesus' claim "I am he" in John 18, and the presence of angels at the tomb. John's Gospel corrects and revises elements in the synoptic passion narratives in light of new developments among the Christian community, and it makes a theological point that Jesus was not crucified twice, and that he bore his own cross. The evangelists increasingly tried to convince their readers that Jesus was crucified from Mark to John because they were responding to Christians who differed about the divinity of Jesus. I would argue that the evangelists were responding to Christians who differed about the crucifixion of Jesus by establishing the most solid fact of history that Jesus was crucified. However, the passion narratives of the Gospels are either historically implausible or most likely myth or legend. Jesus did not say any of these things, and the author of Q probably never heard them, because Jesus was probably never crucified. Dr. MacDonald is a former fundamentalist Baptist pastor and the son of a fundamentalist Baptist pastor. His book Mythologizing Jesus from Jewish Teacher to Epic Hero highlights a major blind spot in New Testament historical scholarship, namely Hellenistic literary mimesis, or more specifically Homeric literary mimesis. The highly educated gospel writers knew that many of these events never happened, and their educated Greek audiences knew that these events probably never happened. The passion narratives in the Gospels were written as literary works of art to make theological and philosophical points. The Gospel writers emphasized that Jesus was walking and teaching and that he was the new Aristotle for the Greco-Roman audiences. The anointing of Jesus by a certain woman in all four Gospels happens prior to the Passion narrative in Mark and Matthew. This woman is not named, and she anoints Jesus' head in Luke. The woman anoints Jesus' feet with oil and with her tears in Mark and John, and in Odyssey Book 19 Odysseus' old wet nurse makes Eurycleia wash his feet and later anoint him with oil. The woman in Bethany who anoints Jesus does this because she is the only one who recognizes that Jesus will die. The woman's deed will be remembered and discussed wherever the good news is preached about the world. Mark's story about Jesus is based on the story of Odysseus, and if it is true, then the New Testament Jesus is a sinner according to his own law, and this story is highly implausible from within the paradigm of modern secular history. Dr. MacDonald says that Bart Ehrman is resistant to this methodology, yet Ehrman offers no alternative explanation, and he also says that Ehrman would have to rewrite half of his famous intro and testament. The Gospels tell us that a Jewish rabbi and messianic claimant celebrated a Passover meal by ordering his disciples to drink his blood and eat his flesh. For a Jew, this would be totally and absolutely revolting, but in various forms of paganism, theophagy was a common ritual, so this is highly questionable historically. A naked young man followed Jesus into the Garden of Gethsemane, where he prayed and was tempted to not go through with his suicide mission. He stayed awake while his disciples slept, and eventually his disciples forsook him and fled. When the men grabbed this young man, he managed to slip out of his linen cloth and run away naked. The identity of this man has baffled scholars for centuries. The women go to the empty tomb and see the same young man dressed in a white robe telling them to go to Galilee. I think this story originated with something Paul said but was interpreted with much license by Mark, so I think that Mark invented a betrayer whose name was, drumroll please, a Jew from the cities who betrayed Jesus and his country bumpkin disciples. Mark really is saying that even if a Jew appears friendly and loving, he's not to be trusted, and that Paul did not have any knowledge of any disciple betraying him. The midnight trial is likely not historical because it violates several rules, such as the fact that Jewish trials were only conducted during the day and that there was a 24-hour waiting period before one could be sentenced, and because Mark knows the transcript. Mark says that Peter was outside warming himself by a fire, but Luke and his perennial Greek teachers made up the dialogue. Mark never claims that the Holy Spirit revealed it to him. That number 8, Pilate's reluctance to condemn Jesus. Mark's depiction of Pilate as a torn man who was essentially manhandled by a shouting rabble of Jews is simply historically implausible. Pilate described himself as a man of inflexible, stubborn, and cruel disposition. Josephus said Pilate was willing to slaughter innocent Jews who peacefully protested the erection of standards of Zeus in Jerusalem. Yet in Matthew we have Pilate washing his hands and saying, "I am free of the blood of this innocent man, let his blood be upon us and our children." Event number 9, Sanhedrin to Pilate to Herod and back again, describes the day Jesus spent before the Sanhedrin, Pilate, Herod, and the place of crucifixion, all before brunch. This is not how real life works. Mark claimed that Pontius Pilate offered a Paschal pardon to a Jewish prisoner named Barabbas, but there is no historical record of Pilate doing such a thing, and Mark was trying to present a more flattering depiction of Roman authorities. Mark invented this story to explain why Paul called Jesus our Passover lamb and how he told a good story. The 2 goats represented 2 versions of the Davidic king Messiah. Jesus was a selfless, non-violent itinerant preacher and got Barabbas, the son of the father, who was a violent political zealot and assassin. The Jews cheered more loudly for Barabbas because he was the type of Messiah that they wanted. However, the Lord wanted Jesus. In the Synoptics we're told that the Romans compelled a man named Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross of Jesus while Jesus walked in front. Was this usual? Would the Romans force innocent men to carry the crosses of the condemned Christians? Claim that Jesus was so battered and beaten that he simply could not carry his cross. Mark says that Simon of Cyrene was the father of Alexander and Rufus, and that he was an ethnically Greek convert to Judaism who was willing to follow Jesus, while Shimon bar Yochai was not willing to follow Jesus. In Genesis 22 we're told that Abraham put wood on the back of Isaac and made him march up a hill to sacrifice him, and in the Gospels a father sacrificing his son is the height of love and glory. Jesus is sold by his brothers for 20 shekels of silver, is imprisoned although he is innocent, and is eventually crucified. Mark modeled his passion narrative upon a Josephine archetype, which is reason enough to have reasonable doubt about its historicity. The Christian apologists say Jesus was bleeding out since the night before and that his body went into shock after just a few hours on the cross. However, Mark tells us that Pilate marveled that Jesus had died so quickly. Mark wants this passion play to end quickly, but the earthquake, darkness, curtain tearing, and dead saints rising from the graves are not historical. If the curtain that veiled the Holy of Holies was torn, it would have been a huge deal for the Jews. Why did no one mention this? Women coming to anoint the body of Jesus is really strange because bodies start to smell shortly after death, and anointing was meant to mask the smell until the body was finally buried or entombed. The women should have been waiting for Jesus to be risen from the dead. The women coming to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body and finding it empty is highly implausible. Event number 19. Hector the son of Priam was the prince of Troy, the son of the king Hector. Hector was abandoned by his fellow Trojans and fled into the city. Hector was the only Trojan left outside Troy. Hector refused to retreat and demonstrated his willingness to suffer and die for his cause. Hector then tried to negotiate with Achilles and then tried to run from him. Achilles stabs Hector in the throat. Jesus is nailed to the cross. John is stabbed in the side. Dogs and birds trample Hector's corpse, and Hector's mother and wife witness the spectacle. Hector's little brother Paris witnesses his brother's gruesome death, and John, the beloved disciple whom Jesus makes his brother woman, behold your son, witnesses his brother's gruesome death. In Book 24 Priam begs for his son's body. In Book 2 of Virgil's Aeneid and in the Gospels the slain Jesus appears to the women. The Toldoth Yeshu is a polemical counter-narrative to the Gospels that probably goes as far back as the late 2nd century. The Jewish writers of these things knew that they were making things up, and they were mocking the New Testament passion narratives and the Gospels with these ancient myths. The author of 2 Peter, who is a charlatan, a forger pretending to be Peter, says something very telling. The author of 2 Peter, who falsely claimed to be an eyewitness to Jesus, was responding to critics who accused the Gospel writers of making up entertaining stories, cleverly contrived myths. The Quran tells us what it's doing, whereas the Gospel writers took Jewish and Greek stories about other people and replaced the protagonist with Jesus. Cleomenes III was a Spartan king and radical political reformer who was killed by the Ptolemies of Alexandria and was crucified while a snake coiled itself around his head, preventing the ravening birds from mutilating his face. A plausible story is that Jesus was not crucified as described in the Passion narratives, and that his death was a result of natural causes. The Gospels are not reliable historical accounts because they are based on oral accounts in circulation for decades, and there was no one there at the time to take notes, and many stories were invented, most were changed. 3 ancient historians wrote about Nero. One said he started the fire, another said he watched it blaze from the Tower of Messinus while playing an instrument and singing about the destruction of Troy, but no one actually saw Nero playing his harp in Rome by the city burned. Nero was a cross-dressing drag queen who loved to perform in drag. Many historians today maintain that it is implausible that Nero was playing his instrument in Rome up on a tower while Rome was burning. This was an unsubstantiated rumor based on biased reports meant to slander a political opponent. In a recent interview, Burton Mack revealed his next project, a scholarly consortium that would redescribe Christian origins in some way other than through the Gospel narratives and their crucifixion drama. Mack believes that the Passion narratives are pure fiction. In the year 3132 or 33 CE, a young rabbi named Jesus of Nazareth traveled from the Galilee to Jerusalem to observe the fasts of the Passover week. At some point during his time in the holy city, Jesus cleansed the temple in some way and marked the earliest gospel. Jesus angered the corrupt temple establishment, who began a propaganda campaign depicting Jesus and his group as potentially dangerous revolutionaries. The Galileans were known for 2 things: fishing and zealotry, the latter being due to the slain Jewish freedom fighter Judas of Galilee, whose sons Jacob and Simon were still active in the Galilee at the time of Jesus. Jesus of Galilee cleansed the temple as a prophetic act of symbolism. He believed that if the temple leadership did not clean up their act, then God's wrath would descend upon them. The ruthless Roman governor of Judea, the evangelists made it appear that Jesus of Nazareth had been crucified, but in fact Barabbas and his men were crucified on the Mount of Olives, and the Romans placed a placard above his head that read Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. John wrote his Gospel around 90 to 100 CE and tried to convince his readers that Jesus of Nazareth was the one crucified, not Barabbas, Simon, etc., and that he was totally dead when he was placed in the tomb. We do not know who may have attended the actual event on the mountain, since Jesus was considered a persona non grata by the temple establishment and Yeshua bar Abba was a convicted insurrectionist. It also seems unlikely that any members of the Sanhedrin temple authorities or Pharisees were present. Christian apologists point out that Mark tells us that several women were looking on from afar and that it was embarrassing that only Jesus' women followers were witnesses. Ehrman and Adenold offer more plausible explanations for the prominence of women in the Gospels. According to Ehrman, Mark's motif was that outsiders get it while insiders, such as Jesus' family members, male disciples, and Jews in general, consistently struggle to profess faith in Jesus. According to Ehrman, we have no idea what Jesus said when he was crucified. The Gospels give us conflicting statements. If Jesus uttered the cry of dereliction from the cross, as I suggested earlier, how would we have known it if a few Jewish leaders heard it? Christian apologists defend the Mark/Smithian Jesus by pointing out that he was quoting the first verse of Psalm 22 as a way of signaling to his audience that God would save him from his afflictions in this world. Psalm 22 is clearly antithetical to Christian theology, and the final words of Jesus sound much more like what Barabbas would have said, a theocratic nationalist who dedicated his life to cleansing the Holy Land of occupying pagans, but who ended up stripped, scourged, beaten, nailed, and crucified by those very pagans. Luke claimed to have a perfect understanding of Jesus' life and times, but instead recorded Jesus saying, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," as his final words. This begs several important questions. The women attending the crucifixion did not tell Peter or Matthew about Jesus' final conversation with Mary and his beloved disciple, Jesus' promise of paradise to one of the Lystas, or Jesus being stabbed by Roman centurion. Perhaps Peter and Matthew did not believe the women. Luke, John, and Matthew believed that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified not because they were told by eyewitnesses or disciples who encountered eyewitnesses, but because they were representatives of the Pauline churches whose founder believed the rumors. God's Son made himself a human sacrifice for sin, and Mark and Matthew placed Psalm 22:1 upon the lips of the dying Jesus of Nazareth to make a theological point, although the accounts of Luke and John are more plausible. Mark scoured the Tanakh for something he could utilize as a proof text. The best he could find was Psalm 22. However, verse 16 was distorted by post-New Testament church fathers to make it clearer for Bible readers. One would think that the evangelists would have jumped at quoting this verse in their passion narratives, but they didn't. They missed that all four gospel authors mentioned that the soldiers casted lots for Jesus' garments while he hanged on the cross. The Jewish Publication Society rendered the last part of this verse as "like a lion they are at my hands and my feet." The phrase "they are at" is not found in the original Hebrew but is implied by the context. The Septuagint translated Psalm 22 as "they pierced my hands and my feet," but the Gospel writers did not know this because the Greek text was altered based upon a deliberate misreading of the original Hebrew, and it was only discovered after the composition of the Gospels. The early Christian apologists intentionally falsified the Greek translation of the psalm, and the rabbis point out that Zechariah chapter 13 prophesied the appearance of a false prophet with wounds in his hands, so I would argue that this is the New Testament Jesus. Pontius Pilate allowed the crucified Jesus to remain on the cross for several days. Pilate ordered multiple crucifixions on the Passover, but now Mark wanted to entomb Jesus as soon as possible for the sake of his theological narrative. Mark created someone of influence in that someone was Joseph of Arimathea, who gave Jesus an expensive above-ground spacious rock tomb. Mark wants us to believe that Joseph of Arimathea offered his precious family tomb to an itinerant Galilean preacher he met a few days ago who was crucified by Rome and mocked for being a false Messiah. But how does Mark explain this? Some of the temple leaders heard that someone named Jesus was crucified, while others said it must have been Jesus of Nazareth. The dominant position among secular historians that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified is quite simple. Really, some of the Jewish leaders believed that Jesus Barabbas was crucified instead. The prophet Jesus neither swooned nor was divinely raptured from the cross. Theory also accounts for the disciples seeing Jesus after the crucifixion. Some of them simply remained in his company while he kept a low profile somewhere in Jerusalem. I believe that the disciples experienced something supernatural after the crucifixion event, and that this experience had a profound effect upon them. James, Peter, and John, the three pillars, along with others, returned to Jerusalem and founded a sect of Judaism known as the Nazareans, or the Branchites, under the leadership of Jesus' brother James the Nazarene. They stressed asceticism and charity, love for the poor, and relationship with God. James, nicknamed the Just, was a highly revered figure who led the Jerusalem place-based Nazarenes until his eventual assassination by the temple, called almost 30 years after Jesus did. James had a brother named Apollo, but we have no record of any of his authentic writings or epistles. Apollo's brother was Paul of Tarsus, who hijacked the entire movement. Paul's conversion story in Acts is also a mnemonic of popular anti-Cid and Greek literature. In the Bacchae, the Greek playwright Euripides mentions that the king of Thebes, whose name was Pantheus, was persecuting members of the cult of Dionysus, and Dionysus says to Pantheist, "I would control my rage and sacrifice to him." The story of the persecuted God-man and the resurrected divine Son of God is most likely fiction, But a second historically plausible story is premised upon the plausibility that the Gospel Passion narratives are mostly or completely legendary, and I think I demonstrated that. According to Paul, the Jews killed Jesus, and the Quran says they did not kill him nor crucify him post-mortem. Paul does not mention Roman involvement at all, and this verse is authentic. No Roman involvement, and this is consistent with Josephus, the Toledo Yeshu, the Talmud, and Maimonides, who all say that Jesus was killed by the Jewish court debate. No Roman involvement, and this is also consistent with the Quran, which quotes some of the Jewish authorities boasting that they had killed Jesus. Most historians would say that John the Baptist and Jesus were very close, and that Jesus considered John to be his teacher. Herod unlawfully married his brother's wife, and the daughter of Herodias wanted to kill the Baptist, but she couldn't. But she saw an opportunity, so he threw a huge birthday party for himself, and the daughter of Herodias danced for all of his guests and asked for the head of John the Baptist. From a historical standpoint, this story sounds like a romance novel, but according to Josephus, Herod Antipas imprisoned the Baptist because he was afraid that the Baptist might eventually lead a rebellion against him. Josephus tells us that Herod imprisoned John the Baptist at the fortress of Machaerus and executed him, but he doesn't say how he was executed. John the Baptist was stoned and crucified, or just crucified in the Telatiphy issue, but Tabor points out that he was killed at a fortress far away from his supporters. There might have been Jewish leaders and members of the temple cult in Jerusalem who assumed that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified by Herod Antipas, and then some heard that Jesus was seen alive thereafter. The crucifixion of Jesus is not multiply attested in historical sources, because Paul wrote that Jesus was crucified in multiple letters, and because Mark, Matthew, and Luke depended on Paul, and because John had knowledge of the synoptics. One source, Paul, is plausible. None of the gospel writers were eyewitnesses, and Matthew and Luke created material themselves. That's why they don't agree. The unique crucifixion details of the Gospel of John are clearly inventing and contradict the popular Christian narrative, but the earliest known Roman reference to the crucifixion is in the Annals of Tacitus, which is an important independent i.e. non-Christian text that confirms the gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion. The earliest source about Jesus that we know of does not mention Jesus' alleged crucifixion. It is not in Q, which was plausibly earlier than Paul, so it is not an early source. It is also likely that there were Christian factions in various cities around the Mediterranean that denied the crucifixion. Paul heard rumors that a man named Jesus was crucified, but that certain people claimed to have seen him after his death. Paul's understanding insisting that Jesus did die as Messiah was not embarrassing at all. The historical plausibility of an uncrucified Jesus of Nazareth is argued to be highly improbable, and if someone doesn't admit that